Hello, class. This next PowerPoint is based on the historical context of bilingual education, the colonial times. The U.S. founders envisioned a country with a unified history, with unified traditions, and with a common language. The vision was based largely on the English legal system and schooling practices. Given this Anglo-Saxon orientation at the dawn of the nation's history, the colonizers set the stage for the role of symbolic politics of language and ethnic identity in the United States. The European languages were more likely than others to be treated with respect, and their speakers to be accommodated in schooling and government services. The potential for controversy over language policy was present from the very beginning. The conditions producing today's official English movement have been present in the United States since before the country's founding 2 centuries ago, and the arguments both for and against official English have been repeated. Arguments both for and against official English have been present since the history of the country. Absence of a consistent language ideology creating a resentment among minority groups. This has in turn had consequences over pedagogical practices to better serve the English language learner population. General linguistic tolerance. It would be inaccurate to conclude that an American view of bilingualism existed at this time. There was no view of bilingualism. From the 1700s to the 1880s, many immigrant communities hung on to their maternal language as a way to preserve cultural traditions, creating religious services, newspapers, and schools serving that particular population. They had what Havinghurst of 1978 calls defensive pluralism, believing that it was feasible to maintain their ancestral ways of life while participating in the civil life of the nation. A number of states passed laws that authorized bilingual education. During the second half of the 19th century, bilingual or non-bilingual language instruction was provided in some form in many public and private schools, including Czech in Texas, French in Louisiana, and Spanish in the Southwest. In 1900, approximately 600,000 children, 4% of the elementary school population, were receiving all of part of their instruction in German. Likewise, at the turn of the century, in New Mexico, either Spanish or English or both could be the language of a school's curriculum. During the period of the 1880s to the 1960s, the American Protective Association promoted English-only school laws, which Illinois and Wisconsin adopted in 1889. The Naturalization Act of 1906 established that to become naturalized U.S. citizens, immigrants must be able to speak English. 1918 to 1920, the Bureau of Naturalization and the Bureau of Education of the U.S. sponsored the teaching of English to aliens and native illiterates. By 1923, the legislatures of 34 states had dictated English-only instruction in all private and public primary schools. The result of anti-German hostility during World War I caused the push for monolingualism. The push for homogeneity became a well-established pattern within schools during the first half of the 20th century. During this period, many large urban schools created Americanization classes to prepare immigrants for integration into mainstream society. Although the new regulations emphasized English-only instruction, the debate over the role of the heritage tongue still continued. In Meyer versus Nebraska in 1923, the Supreme Court declared Nebraska's prohibition against teaching foreign languages in elementary schools to be unconstitutional on the basis of the 14th Amendment. The case favored immigrant groups to cultivate their language. However, it had little effect in promoting bilingual education. Political, social, and economic rationales for denigrating all languages other than English advanced linguistic and cognitive theories that attacked bilingualism. English was seen as the language of the educated. Those who did not speak English were seen as mentally retarded, and ignorance of English was attributed to the inferior intelligence of the immigrant students. Intellectual achievement and knowledge of English were synonymous. Some research even blamed the use of native languages at home as the cause of children's mental retardation. Classes had an ethnocentric attitude, presenting U.S. cultural patterns as being more desirable than the immigrants' ancestral cultures and languages, from Hyman of 1988. The predominant method to educating language minority students in the U.S. during this period was the sink or swim method, also known as immersion. Most educators and policymakers felt that it was up to the language minority students, not the schools, to make the linguistic, cultural, and cognitive adjustment necessary to achieve assimilation into the American society. ESL served only adults. The assumption was that children learn languages easily and nothing is to be done. Many students were put back a grade or two or retained until they showed some progress. Teachers punished children who were found speaking other languages. Massive school failure prompted the creation of bilingual programs in isolated communities in Arizona, California, Florida, New Mexico, Texas, and New Jersey in order to improve the education of their children. English and the student's native language was used in all grades for language and content instruction. Some included English speakers. Programs were examples of excellence. World War II served as the first wake-up call regarding the United States' inadequacies in foreign language instruction, especially after immigration increased in the U.S. Although the National Defense Education Act of 1958 aimed at raising the level of foreign language education in the United States, it failed to nurture linguistic diversity. This gap began to be filled slowly in the 1960s as a result of the Civil Rights Movement and the 1964 Civil Rights Act. As a result of the 1965 Immigration Act, larger numbers of Asians and Latin Americans started to enter the country. With this demographic shift, more language minority students from these regions of the world appeared in U.S. classrooms where bilingual instruction was needed. Although I hate to admit it, the rebirth of bilingual education also owes a great debt to the Fidel Castro's Cuban Revolution of 1959. The exiled Cubans who arrived in Florida envisioned that their sojourn in the United States would be short-lived. They believed that Fidel Castro would be overthrown soon. Thus, they just wanted their children to retain their language and culture in preparation for their return home. To educate the exile of these children, to educate these children in English while maintaining the Spanish language, the Cuban community in 1963 established a highly successful two-way bilingual education program at Coral Way Elementary School in Dade County, Florida. This is my hometown, and I'm very aware of this Coral Way Elementary School. Although I was not fortunate enough to enter the bilingual program at this time, I was one of those sink or swim students when I came to the United States from Cuba. This stimulated other bilingual immersion programs in Florida and in other parts of the country, and the bilingual education began. To aid and monitor the education of English language learners through mother tongue and English education, the federal government enacted the Bilingual Education Act. The Title VII of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in 1968. As the offshoot of President Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty, the Act strove to help language minority students, especially Hispanics. As a result of the Bilingual Education Act, many elementary and some secondary bilingual education programs and ESL programs were initiated, especially in the Southwest. So although the Act was unclear as of its position with respect to bilingual education, it was a significant step in moving away from the sink-or-swim educational practices of the first half of the century. The goal of the original bill was the maintenance of bilingualism of students who already knew another language. This goal was replaced by the use of the student's home language to facilitate the acquisition of English only. This goal was to use the student's home language to facilitate the acquisition of English only, but its maintenance was not encouraged. The federal legislation provided funds to create bilingual programs in poor school districts. Programs promoted the use of the student's home language to initiate instruction. A number of states reversed the English-only laws by passing bilingual education legislation. Massachusetts was the first state to enact the law creating its Transitional Bilingual Education Act in 1971. More than 20 other states followed. The act basically stated that the native language was to be used to initiate instruction. English was taught as a second language to initiate literacy in English and later introduced in instruction. The native language of the student was used as a bridge until students knew enough English to be transferred to the mainstream classroom. Bilingual education became an educational strategy rather than a full program of instruction, which prompted the mother language to be seen with a lesser status. The next important event in the rebirth of bilingual education was the 1974 Supreme Court case Lau versus Nichols. The law was the result of a lawsuit by the Chinese families who alleged discrimination on the grounds that they could not achieve academically because they did not understand instruction in English. The law verdict abolished the sink or swim practices of the past and led to the Equal Educational Opportunities Act in August 1974, expanding its jurisdiction to apply to all public school districts. 1975 law remedies brought pressure on schools to implement some kind of meaningful instruction for EOLs. This included that the law recommended bilingual education as the best approach for elementary education. And the law contained instructions for identification, assessment, and mainstreaming of students. More of the law remedies included bilingual education should be implemented in all school districts with at least 20 EOLs who represent the same language. It redirected school districts to provide strong versions of bilingual education for language minority students to enable them to become bilingual, biliterate, and bicultural. The following is a research study that supported the bilingual education. Pearl and Lambert, Ben Sieve, Ianco Worrell, sorry if I butchered that, and Segalowitz, I'm not really good with names, demonstrated cognitive advantages, higher verbal and nonverbal ability, and increased ability to analyze syntax by bilingual speakers. The ability also to differentiate between two languages is not an impediment, was the result of these studies. Castañeda versus Pickard in 1981 is the second most important court decision influencing bilingual education. In the case, the school district in Raymondville, Texas, was charged with violating the civil rights of EOL under the Equal Education Opportunities Act of 1974. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals established a three-step test for assessing language minority students. First, a sound educational theory anchoring school plan. Second, adequate resources and personnel. And third, program must reflect sound practices and language and academic results. 1972 finding of the U.S. Commission of Civil Rights showed that only a small percentage of language minority students were receiving appropriate bilingual ESL instruction in California, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Texas. The battle and debate for bilingual education began to gain strength during the 1980s. The politics of language education during the Reagan and George Bush administration provided the context for anti-bilingualism. The Reagan administration killed the Carter administration's Lao regulation proposals, which mandated bilingual education in schools with at least 25 EOLs of the same minority groups in 2 consecutive grade levels in K through 8. The number of compliance reviews of districts to meet the needs of language minority students by the Office for Civil Rights decreased significantly. Anti-bilingual education pressure groups such as U.S. English, English Only, and English First began to gain support. In